Okay, so part two here of our lecture this week is going to cover, on one hand, sort of the funds going outside of an organization, so the expenses piece to that initial definition of finance. So we're going to talk about some common expenditures for sport organizations, and then we'll shift gears and close out with a brief conversation about kind of external economic factors and how they can impact the financial health of sport organizations. Okay. So when we talk about expenses in the context of the sport industry, really we're focusing on two different subsets of expenses. On one hand, we have operating expenses, which are, as you can see here in the definition, recurring costs associated with doing business. So these are just daily costs of doing business for a sport organization. So things that they know are going to be a part of operating their organization, sort of day-to-day costs associated with keeping the lights on. And then capital expenses, on the other hand, are going to be costs incurred by large-scale projects or purchases. So these are obviously expenses that aren't necessarily happening on a day-to-day basis, like operating expenses, and probably are happening maybe every few years and require quite a bit more planning because of the large-scale nature of those purchases. So I want to give you a few examples here of each category. So if we look at operating expenses, again, these are just kind of day-to-day costs of keeping the lights open, quite literally, for sport organizations. So, payroll, what are you paying your personnel in terms of salary or hourly wages? Those are operating expenses. Um, running air conditioning, heating, keeping the lights on, whatever utilities are associated with running your organization or facility. Obviously, we're talking about the sport industry here, so equipment is going to be probably a primary operating expense for most sport organizations. And then there's going to be a ton of miscellaneous operating expenses for most sport organizations. Anything from promotional materials, ad buys, so on and so forth. Obviously, these are just a handful of examples, but these are costs or expenses associated with keeping the business open on a day-to-day basis. Capital expenses, again, on the other hand, these are more of the large scale purchases that probably don't happen quite as often as operating expenses, right? These are big purchases that require quite a bit of planning. So perhaps a sport organization, purchases some real estate or land that they want to develop on later. That would be an obvious capital expense. Either facility new construction or reconstruction would fall under capital expenses. So the example we looked at earlier with Horton Fieldhouse. And obviously high-priced equipment, whether it's specifically related to sports team or athletics. It could also be the ticket office needs a new ticketing machine or ticket sorter. Any kind of high-priced piece of equipment used to do business would probably fall under capital expenses. So just a very cursory explanation there of expenses that sport organizations might incur. In terms of operating expenses, so sort of those day-to-day costs of doing business, we have to look a little bit deeper, right? Especially if we're talking about planning for a program or planning for an event. It's important that we not only can acknowledge or identify the costs associated with those activities, but also that we can identify the variance in costs. So for operating expenses, generally we're looking at two different types of costs, right? Fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs, as you might assume based on the definition, are costs that are incurred regardless of volume, regardless of number of participants. Fixed costs are predictable costs, right? We know what these costs are going to be. We can plan for them. They don't change based on how much we purchase of something or how many participants we have. They are going to stay the same. Variable costs, on the other hand, as you can tell from our chart here, are costs that change based on volume, right? So variable costs, unlike fixed costs, are generally not that predictable, right? They're harder to predict given that they can change literally on a day-to-day basis. So I thought we'd use an example here to provide a little more context. So a youth basketball league as an example. So you're working and you're planning on putting together a youth basketball league. So some fixed costs you might have associated with this would probably be the facility space, right? So you're going to rent a facility space for a certain amount of time for the event, and that's going to be a fixed cost, right? There's probably a fixed rate associated with that facility. You know what that rate's going to be when you're planning, and it's going to be the same when you show up on the day of the event. So that's a fixed cost that you can plan for. The salary of the event coordinator or coach that you have working the event, that's a fixed cost, right? That's going to be a piece or an item on the budget that you know ahead of time and is not going to change. Variable costs, on the other hand, associated with a basketball league might be things like team shirts, right? The amount of costs associated with buying shirts is probably going to change based on the number of participants that sign up, right? Whether it's the rate that you get for purchasing the shirts if you get more participants, or just the overall change based on volume, that cost is going to change based on the number of kids that sign up. Same is true for equipment. So purchasing basketballs, that's probably going to change based on the number of kids that sign up. Same goes for food, lunch, snacks. All of that's going to be dependent on the number of kids that sign up. So those are going to be variable costs. Again, it's important to be able to identify both fixed costs and variable costs when it comes to financial planning. So certainly you want to incorporate that into the budgeting conversation. But it's also important to consider these costs when we're making decisions around pricing or marketing, right? We want to make sure that the decisions we make surrounding pricing are based on the analysis we've done of the costs associated with an event, right? Otherwise, we're not going to break even or generate a profit. Okay, that's just a real brief conversation about fixed and variable costs. I do want us to kind of expand on this conversation when we meet together in our Zoom chat next week. So we will do kind of a similar assessment, but we're going to do it with the normal Corn Belters, which is our minor league baseball team here in town. I think arguably the best mascot ever in the history of sports. So we'll have another kind of case or practice case around that one where you can get a little bit more discussion on fixed and variable costs. Okay, I want to shift gears now away from the kind of revenues versus expenses conversation and talk a little bit more big picture about both financial and economic factors that impact the sport industry. I think this is an important conversation for us to have in this first week because it's kind of a premise that I want you to weave through the rest of the semester, and I want it to be sort of a foundational knowledge that we all carry with us, and that's that effective sport managers in the sport industry are effective because they have an understanding of not only what's happening internally in their organization, but also externally. And they are quick to adapt. And this is something that I would have said prior to COVID. It's also very true in the midst of COVID. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that as sport practitioners, there is only so much we can control internally. We also have to acknowledge that there are external economic factors that are going to impact what we do on a daily basis, and they're going to impact the financial health of our organizations. Okay, so I would say, as we think about sort of some of these financial issues or economic issues that impact our organization, certainly the health of the overall economy is a huge external factor in that, right? The health of the economy tends to dictate the health of the sport industry, right? Historically, we can look and we can see that in economic cycles where our economy is in, a stage of growth or a peak stage, sports tends to be doing pretty well, right? And that's not particularly surprising, right? Given that when the economy is doing well, wages are strong, people are employed, then they have money to spend on sports, right? They have money to spend on extras beyond just their bills and getting by every month. So obviously, the economic cycle impacts the health of the sport industry, and vice versa, right? So when things are good, but also when we're in economic cycles of recession, that certainly has a ripple effect on sport organizations as well. So if we look back to not that long ago, back in the 2008 recession, we can see that This also had a major impact on job growth in the sport industry at the time. And you could see a pretty big dip in terms of employees kind of in the years following that 2008 recession. And that it did take several years for the industry to get back into that growth cycle. And that really did follow along with the overall US economy. So, I show this for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the economy has major impact on the health of the sport industry, but also to maybe give you a little bit of hope that, even though we might be in a tough time right now, and the jobs picture might look a little bleak for you as you think about working in the sport industry amid this pandemic. Know that it is a cycle, and these cycles do turn around, and typically there is a growth period following a recession. So I say that knowing firsthand because I graduated college in 2008. So I've been there in the tough times, and I know what this is like, and I know that there are cycles to it. So important to acknowledge that. A couple of other things to mention in terms of economic factors that impact the sport industry or external factors. Obviously, changes in laws or policy can also have major impact on the sport industry. There were recent changes in the tax code a few years ago into the Trump presidency that have had sort of a major ripple effect for sport organizations looking to sell tickets, especially to businesses who once could, deduct certain amounts of their sport-related expenditures. And the tax code has changed and they're not able to do that anymore. So, that's one example of sort of a shift in law having an impact on the financial health of the sport industry. But obviously, there are several others, and I hope to include some of those into our conversation this semester. Another thing to keep in mind is in terms of external economic factors impacting the industry, interest levels or participation rates are something that impact what we do. So, we can look at the sort of the shift in young people sort of watching traditional sports like, say, Major League Baseball versus something like esports, right? And we're seeing a huge shift in interest right now for those young people kind of moving away from the traditional sports like baseball and finding more interest in things like esports. And we're seeing how that impacts the industry in real time right now. So those are things, again, they're external to what we do, but they're having a major impact on the industry. So, and those are just a handful of, external factors that might impact the sport organization that you're working for. And obviously, these things change over time. But, the main idea here is just to be aware that while you can only control so much from an internal perspective at your organization, those that are able to identify these external factors ahead of time and prepare appropriately are probably going to be the ones that are in the best situation down the road. Okay, one last thing that I wanted to mention here as part of this conversation about the economy and the financial health of the sport industry is that sports teams back in sort of this 2008, 2010 era of recession did adapt. They did make decisions that were necessary at the time to sort of adapt and adjust given the current landscape. And I think what we're going to see now and maybe in the next few years is that sport organizations are going to have to do the same, right? They're going to have to adapt. And we're already seeing that in some cases through COVID. So, back in 2007, 2010, when the recession was happening, some of the ways teams changed or adapted their business operations, obviously saw a lot of teams discounting product. The country was in a deep recession, so people didn't necessarily have the expandable income that they used to have. So, providing really deep promotions, getting creative with that was something that was happening for a lot of teams just to get people in the door. Another thing that a lot of teams did back in during this recession was sort of expanding their product and what they did. So you saw a ton of teams, especially at the professional level, buying up real estate, because interest rates were low at the time to sort of, reinvigorate the economy. So you saw a lot of teams purchase land that maybe they weren't even going to use right away, but down the road they could either use to develop a facility on or potentially sell once the market turned around. So that was obviously something kind of reserved for teams that were in pretty good financial health because they could afford to make those investments. Another thing that teams did or organizations did at the time is try to diversify their markets, right? Kind of looking beyond sort of the typical demographic of fans that they had been appealing to for years and try to diversify that approach. And, in some cases that worked, in some cases that didn't. I think teams really had to kind of evaluate who their core market was and also identify that demographics were changing in the country too and have continued to change. So I think that's a shift or adaptation that's continued. Another common adaptation for teams in times of recession is sort of trying to identify any kind of sustainable revenue, right? If we think back to our conversation earlier, we identified the main sources of revenue for sports teams. When you're in a recession and you can't necessarily rely heavily on those earned income lines like ticket sales or concessions or merch, you have to be able to identify sustainable revenues, right? Revenues that aren't going to change based on how many people are coming to your games. And I think that's why you saw back in this time period a major shift towards television, right? And you saw a major shift in what those broadcasting deals looked like. And teams, I think, and organizations in general were able to acknowledge that television tends to be a pretty stable thing, right? Even when people can't go to events, they can still watch from home. And obviously, the entire television and cable landscape has changed since then as well and continues to change. But I think that was one example of teams looking to what are the sustainable lines of revenue that we can look to. And that was something that happened back in 2008, 2010, and now I think we're seeing some of those organizations be able to rely on those subsets of revenue in times like COVID. So again, just wanted to have a brief conversation there of sort of what happened back in the Great Recession, because I do think there are some parallels to what's happening now, and I think it will be interesting for us to watch and for you to watch, firsthand how sport organizations are going to respond during our current recession and what that's going to look like moving forward. All right, so that was a huge overview of sport finance. And I know it was a lot of information, and I know it covered a lot of different pieces, but hopefully after reading the textbook assignment for this week and reviewing the two video lectures, you feel like you have kind of a good foundation of knowledge for us to be able to now move forward with some more technical areas of finance and sport. So make sure that after you've finished your reading and after you finish reviewing these videos that you take care of the action items in ReggieNet as well, and then you will be ready to meet on Zoom when we get together next week. So thanks for your time. Have a good rest of your day.